welcome to Cabinet meeting on Thursday 11th of May. We've got a full agenda ahead of us today, so if we just crack on. Item number 1, apologies for absence, everyone is here. Item number 2, declarations of interest. None. We can now move on to item number 3, which is COVID Reserve Review of 2022-23 allocation and proposals for 23-24. And this is a report by the Director of Business Operations and Partnerships. So over to Louise. Thank you, Louise.
Okay, thanks, Leader. So the paper today covers two purposes. We want to update on progress with proposals that we brought to Cabinet in October 22 about use of the COVID Reserve for community support and cost of living. And we're bringing forward a new and near final tranche of proposals for 23-24. So those new proposals total at the current time to 1.7 million to help mitigate what are known as the 4 harms of the pandemic. Cabinet will be aware that Scottish Government allocated various funding streams or temporary funding streams to local authorities to react to the emerging demands of the pandemic and to support local residents, businesses and services with the challenges that arose from the pandemic. Our general COVID grant represents non-recurring funds and they must be used to support COVID response, recovery or renewal. So that's what we're talking about here. In October, you approved a series of proposals which also totalled just short of 1.7 million, and there was a focus at that time on community recovery and provision of direct support over the winter to some of our most vulnerable residents. You'll remember that we'd shaped those proposals in collaboration with partners, and we were trying to balance the immediate support over that winter period with a range of measures that would boost capacity in communities for the longer term recovery. And they built further on 1.469 million of proposals which came to Cabinet in August last year as part of the Local Authority COVID Economic Recovery Fund, LACER. And you'll get an update on progress with LACER after the summer recess. Economic Development will be leading on that. So for the moment, Annex 1 gives you an update on those October proposals. They've been overseen by a monthly multi-agency group, and there have been a couple of member officer briefing sessions also held over the winter. There's going to be too much to cover everything here, but I think Cabinet will agree that good progress has been made across those initiatives, including a payment we made in March to over 2,000 local children, the ones that are in free school meals for low income purposes, or clothing grants. They all got £130 each. Support to social work families at Christmas. There's been fuel support and energy advice to local people, a cost of living campaign and a warm spaces programme that saw over 3,500 attendances across 33 community organisations who had bid for some resource to provide those warm spaces. It's important to note that final reconciliations on those October proposals of the spend are still being collated, so it is likely there'll be an element of underspend on some of those proposals, and the plan would be to come back and deal with that later this year with a further and final set of proposals, probably around October time. So there's currently 1.7 million unallocated in the COVID Reserve, and a new set of proposals have been prepared here, looking this time more closely at gaps in recovery, some mitigations of areas where we have seen evidenced increased demand, and where there are also some opportunities to seed fund local, longer term, more sustainable approaches. This is the last funding we have, so we need to get communities back up and running and able to do some of these things for themselves. Each area of the proposals has been linked back to one of the 4 harms of the pandemic, and we do have evidence-based need behind each of the proposals. They come under 6 themes, so because this is our general COVID Reserve, we have to have a contingency for response. So there is the first set of proposals is around actually how we respond to the ongoing impact of the pandemic. The second is about how we recover as an organisation, both the Council and the Health and Social Care Partnership, recovering backlogs and building back levels of service that have perhaps not yet recovered. There are proposals around wellbeing support for vulnerable individuals. There's community recovery and capacity building work. There's financial advice and direct support to individuals. And then there are direct financial supports for residents. Now most of that will come back in autumn for a further decision around that. I've just put in some placeholders just now around that. So once again, these are one-off finite resources. We do need to have enough flex to meet any unplanned COVID demand. There are some unknowns at this stage about how the cost of living crisis will play out as we head through this year, what energy payments will look like, etc. So we need to be a bit prudent. So we've therefore recommended keeping some of the funding back. And we will return, as I say, with a final set of proposals in October. And that will include any underspend from last October's proposals. At that point. So we would seek delegation to myself and the Head of Accountancy to work in consultation with the leader to exercise flexibility in these proposals within the spirit of the 6 themes that I've outlined, but also to support boosting recovery, supporting capacity building and supporting vulnerable local people. So Cabinet's asked to approve the recommendations of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. I'll open this up to Cabinet members. Councillor Bragnon.
I welcome these set of proposals. I think they will make a tremendous amount of difference to the people we train while we continue to recover from COVID. I also appreciate how much hard work has gone in to creating these proposals. It's taken many departments and the Health and Social Care Partnership to come together to present their ideas. I also welcome the additional funding for the Health and Social Care Partnership. It's been quite clear that we're struggling with demand and COVID has had a huge impact. And it's also important to note that strengthening the capacity of the Healthcare Minds programme, which we're leading the way in East Renfrewshire, is really important because it could prevent young people getting to crisis support, and it could prevent them having to enter CAMHS, which we know CAMHS waiting lists are very high at the moment. But this could hopefully prevent this being the case. So I welcome these proposals and I thank everyone for their efforts.
Thank you, Councillor Pragnell. Any other comments? Councillor Anderson.
Thank you, Leader. Oh, it's very loud. But yeah, it's really excellent to see and really want to commend it and just the priorities that's been shown here and specifically echo possibly what Councillor Pragnell said about I'm concerned about the young people in mental health and any additional support to mitigate against that is very welcome. I'm also concerned though about families and about it's great to see the additional financial advice and support that's going to be maintained and continued because there is talk of this debt time bomb for a lot of people as a result of COVID and the cost of living crisis. So very welcome to see. So excellent report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Anderson. Any other questions, comments? I'd just like to echo some of those comments. I think Cabinet really welcomes this additional 1.7 million COVID recovery and cost of living package. I'd like to thank officers and actually the wider community for the huge amount of work they've put into helping our communities recover. It's hugely appreciated by the people of East Renfrewshire. It's clear that the £4.4 million package we put together last year is having a significant impact on recovery, and we look forward to seeing more details of that later in the year. The £1.7 million package this year is a balanced package focusing on the 4 harms of COVID, which Louise has identified. I look forward to the Cabinet update in October when we can review again what direct assistance we can provide for our residents for next winter. I think that will be an important piece of work. So again, I would just like to thank everyone for all the hard work in dealing with this crisis in our community over the last year. It's not finished and we've still got work to do in the next year. It's important work and I thank you all very much. So with that, I'd like to go to the recommendations on the paper. It is recommended that Cabinet A note the good progress made towards delivering the proposals in 22-23 from the allocation of 1.7 million of COVID reserves in October 22 to support recovery. Note the details of the final tranche of COVID recovery reserves available in 23-24. C, approve the strategic approach to support recovery under the following key areas which are related to the 4 harms which Louise referred to. 1, COVID contingency response. 2, organisational recovery, 3, wellbeing support for vulnerable individuals, 4, community recovery and capacity building, 5, financial advice and support to individuals, and 6, direct financial and winter support to residents. D, we approve the outline funding proposals with allocations against the above key areas, totalling 1.7 million. We delegate to the Director of Business Operations and Partnerships, Head of Accountancy, in consultation with the Leader of the Council, to exercise flexibility in the terms of these proposals to ensure most effective use of funding. And F, agree that a report with more detailed winter support proposals, still within the funding envelope of 1.7 million, unless there is additional underspends become available, will be brought back to Cabinet for consideration in October 23. And G, note that a final report outlining actual spend and updating on delivery and impact will come back to future Cabinet meeting in 2024. So are we all agreed with that? Thank you very much. Great piece of work, Louise. Thanks, much appreciated. Moving on to the next item on the agenda is item 4, which is Local Government Benchmarking Framework 21-22 performance. And I think Jamie is going to lead on this paper. Thanks, Jamie.
Good morning. The paper in front of Council is, as you've said, the Local Government Benchmarking Framework, which has been in place since 2010 and through work with COSLA, Solace and the Improvement Service, with the Improvement Service leading on the coordination and the collection and analysis of data that allows elected members and officers to see how we're performing in key areas against other councils. It's worth saying that there is a time lag with this data, so it is very much 21-22 data, and that it's from that year, and it reflects the position that was taking place during the height of the pandemic. It's also worth saying that the data shouldn't be seen necessarily just as a crude league table. That analysis should not be considered, the indicators should not be considered in isolation, instead used as a can opener or a primer for discussions around understanding variations in performance and circumstances. So with those caveats in mind, it is worth saying that we are performing comparatively very well in a number of key indicators, including education attainment, where we're top nationally in around 7 indicators. We have the highest household recycling rates, high levels of performance relating to absence rates for teachers, and high participation rates for 16 to 19-year-olds. There are some areas where we're performing comparatively less well, including the cost per attendance of sport and leisure facilities. And despite cost reductions in these areas, we've remained slightly above the family group average, but we have queried that with the Improvement Service and are looking for more information on the measures that are sitting underneath there so that we can understand that in more detail. There are also cost of road maintenance, largely due to lockdown delaying planned roads resurfacing schemes and awaiting the outcome of certain funding bids. But as our resurfacing programme is now back on track, we're hopeful that should improve, alongside the decision to commence a 5-year funding arrangement that should improve the condition of our roads as well over time. We've also, just worth pointing out, there's some measures related to economic development and tourism. Again, related to our local circumstances and the lack of national tourist attractions within the area, but I would also draw your attention to the fact that the Environment Department are currently exploring the opportunities to deliver a wide varied programme of activities to develop East Renfrewshire in that regard. And also there was some challenges around the business and industry planning applications, again related to the pandemic circumstances at the time and staffing resource. Finally, it's also just worth pointing out that there is a data issue that we've noted in relation to the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, and both the data and the ranking we believe is incorrect, and we've highlighted that to the Improvement Service. So all departments in HSCP have reviewed the LGBF data and the trends that are set out in Annex 1, and really now we're bringing this forward to Cabinet and inviting Cabinet to scrutinise the Council's performance against the LGBF indicators and the intended actions taken by departments to improve these, and consider whether any other aspects of the Council performance is in need of improvement or further investigation.
Jamie, thanks very much, and we welcome this very, very thorough report. There's an awful lot of detail in this, and I know Cabinet members have a number of questions, so we'll take it section by section, if that's okay with everyone. So if I can lead with children's services, so can I pass on to Councillor Anderson?
Thank you, Leader. Yes, there's a lot in this, and actually, I mean, this is produced annually, obviously, but there's so much in it. I would think that we could be sitting here talking about this for quite some time, and it's almost actually deserving, I think, of its own meeting. Really, just to focus purely on this, because it's key indicators. Although, Jamie, you mentioned the caveats. So, it's a starting point, I think, is what you were saying about a discussion around the indicators, the benchmarks. So, there was one thing, actually, the very first thing that I noticed about the ring fencing of finance and how the growth of 18% to 23%. Is that a trend that's been ongoing, or do you think that was a one-off? Potentially, I think that's maybe for you, Margaret.
Yes, I think it does seem to be an increasing trend. There are lots of arguments as to how that's measured, whether it's by direct ring fencing or indirect control. But I think a few years ago, COSLA did mention that they believed that the amount of budget that we had free reign over was actually much smaller than these figures would suggest. So I think over many years there's been an increasing trend towards the Council having less freedom over how it spends its money. I wouldn't necessarily say that the proportionate increase from between these 2 years is typical of the year-to-year movement, but I think overall, over a long period, yes, we're having less freedom.
Okay, that's excellent, thank you. Yeah, that's the concern. Less flexibility for the Council to actually adjust its own finances. So, sorry, moving on then. Obviously, education, children's services, and the culture and leisure, a particular area of interest for me. And I think there's three things really. The first one is excellent to see again the attainment of our young people and their performance and their schooling, the school awards, etc. And so it's really great to see that. But then obviously we look further into it, and specific concern about attainment gap in literacy and numeracy. And I think, Mark, obviously it'd be appropriate for you maybe to address or to talk to that.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Yeah, I mean, I guess the two indicators that you're referencing is the literacy gap and the numeracy gap in CFE. I mean, I guess I would set the context with the measures that sit also above that in terms of where our young people end up in terms of the senior phase, with the those in quintile 1 being the highest performing of all the local authorities. The pattern in terms of literacy and numeracy for CFE attainment was different in East Renfrewshire than most other local authorities. The main national report makes reference to this. Elected members will be aware from the presentations we've given at Education Committee that 21-22 we still saw the impact of COVID in our schools. There was significant absence for pupils and there was significant absence for staff during that year, to the extent that elected members will be aware that things like the SQA exams were amended. Other local authorities also reference that throughout the year. However, their pattern of attainment saw significant increases for all young people, and particularly for those in all quintiles. In East Renfrewshire, we saw an overall decrease for our primary attainment of around about 1%. But what we saw was that impact of staff, particularly of pupil absence, hitting our most deprived communities most significantly. And so the performance of our young people in Quintile 1, the gap increased, and that was what we reported to Education Committee at a number of occasions. I think there's two things there. One, clearly we know about the gap, and we've got a number of things in place to address that. So we've got our strategic equity funding, our focus there. We just had the paper on COVID reserves. That money is also designed to address that, and we'll be able to report to elected members the impact of that at the end of the school year. I think there's also a query for me in terms of the, I guess, the measure that's based on. So that's based on curriculum for excellence levels. That's a teacher judgment. It's about professional judgments, a holistic judgment throughout the year. It's not based on a test. And I guess what we've been doing is a lot of work with our teachers within the local authority and wider across the West Partnership and nationally to make sure that there is that understanding of standards that is the same and consistent across all local authorities. I think there's still work to be done nationally on that. Given that everybody else saw an increase, I have to say I would question that given the continued impact of COVID, and it's something that we're keen to learn. We've done some exploring with all the local authorities to make sure we're learning from that in terms of that benchmarking.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I think the work we've done since, hopefully in the extra COVID reserves, etc., something very conscious of, and hopefully we're going to see an improvement in that. You touched on it as well, obviously. I believe it's actually, so the improvement service, they don't have the figures yet for the school attendance of all children that have looked after children, because we'd be keen to see that. It's literally due out in May this month, I believe.
So attendance is collected and reported nationally every 2 years. So although we collect it at a local level, there wouldn't be a national collection in that way. It's only every 2 years. So that will be done. Schools will submit that at the end of June, and it will be collected by the Scottish Government in that way. So, but in terms of the attendance, it's something that we monitor very carefully within our own schools. Clearly, if they're not in school, then they're not able to learn. So it's something that we, continue to focus on. Elected members will be aware that as part of our strategic equity funding, there's that focus on sort of health and well-being, on emotionally based school absence and trying to address that. And they're sort of key areas for us. And working with parents as well, because what we've seen post-COVID is that general attendance has dropped. It has disrupted that usual expectation that you go to school. Parents are much more likely to take holidays and so on. And whilst that maybe doesn't affect some children's attainment, it is affecting others. And so we need to try and work with parents to make sure that there is that expectation that they're in school and able to learn.
Great, thank you. And also recently I was at Mayor's Castle, Parents' Council, and they had a discussion there about the hub, I think as they call it, and which I think is helping significantly with children who are struggling to return to school. So great, thanks for that. With regards to the trust, if we could move on to that, if you don't mind, and looking at the figures there, and we've had a discussion with Anthony about this at the trust about. Can you talk about again, variations a word that's crept up, and benchmarks are very useful, but they have to be like for like comparison. Can you talk to that, please? Thanks.
Happy to, Councillor Anderson. Yeah, I mean, I think Jamie referenced this in his introduction. The whole purpose of the benchmarking framework is to act as that can opener, and if it does that and it allows those comparisons, then it's doing its job. I have to say I'm not convinced for these two indicators for the Trust that it's working effectively. They are costs per visit, cost per sports visit and cost of library visits. So there's two elements to it. There's the finance part of that, and the Council has worked really hard with the improvement service previously. Margaret's team, along with my team, linked in with the improvement service to do what they called a deep dive to make sure that, again, in terms of what different elements of finance were being included, that was consistent across 32 local authorities. Some progress was made. I still think there's probably further work that's needed on that. The other element of those is obviously the number of visits, and I think that's where we're seeing significant concerns. The Improvement Service have on their website the actual data, so you can go in and see the number of visits, and maybe just to give Cabinet some reassurance around that, it does seem very difficult to understand. So if I take the number of visits to libraries, Eastern Bartonshire has 711,000 during that 21-22, East Renfrewshire 191,000. There were 540,000 in Inverclyde, Glasgow City 1.1 million, Renfrewshire 2.1 million, and Edinburgh 9.8 million. So there is clearly something very unusual about the way those are being recorded. It is not consistent. There is virtual visits sometimes being captured, sometimes the way that people are routed through the council website then counts sometimes that as visits. So we've asked the Improvement Service to go away and look at that, because essentially that as a can opener is not working, because we're bringing these measures to you and it's not triangulating with the other data that we have that's being presented to council through things like the NGA performance report or the trust business plan. So very happy to update Cabinet when we've got more information on that, if that would be helpful.
Just another observation on that. It's still good to see, though, that the percentage of adults that are satisfied with the libraries and leisures quite high by the looks of it, and we're 12th and 17th. So at least hopefully that's a good thing to look at instead of because of the anomalies with the collection. Thank you.
Any other questions on education services? Are we okay with that? I'd just like to close this section by mentioning, and Mark mentioned this as well, this is actually very old data, 21-22. Obviously it was a very strong year for education services, which we're all delighted to see, and it continues to be the best in Scotland, which is wonderful. We did address the attainment gap back in October last year. And as soon as the data was available, we looked at it. You looked at it at the committee. We scrutinised that, tried to address what was going on, and actioned it. And Cabinet listened to those concerns at that stage and put more money into COVID recovery, specifically for those attainment gaps. So although we're reviewing it now, we actually have actioned a lot of that some time ago, and it'll be good to see how that has impacted as we look into the following year. So thank you very much for that. So if I can move on to the next section, which is, I think Councillor Anderson has dealt with culture and leisure. Parks and open spaces, is there any issues there? Page 34, any questions there? No. Economic development and planning, page 35, no? Yes. Yep. Yeah, just come on that.
Just going on to economic development and planning, it's great to see that unemployed people assisted into work from the Council's operated funding employability programme improved from 7.3 to 17.5, which is a huge jump. And clients being referred to employability services were more job ready than the previous year. So it's a great improvement. Is there a breakdown in the actual areas these people are coming from?
I can provide that information.
Yeah, but it's quite important if you can provide that, just to make sure it's hitting the right areas of deprivation.
On that indicator, just to make comment that very often an indicator like this is very much responsive to the economic conditions that we're operating in, and clearly there is a labour market shortage, so getting people into work at this current time in some way, there's a demand for those jobs. So it's not necessarily a measure of the service itself, sometimes it's the wider economy and what's happening in it, but obviously the service is responding to that and helping more people into work. So it's important people understand the wider context that indicator delivers against.
Sorry, just to come in, the indicator states there's a big improvement, so that pleases me.
Any other questions on economic development? Do you want to carry on with housing services? Yeah.
just in regards to the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. Over the past 10 years, 15 years, we've been trying to achieve this Scottish Housing Quality Standard, benchmarker against other councils who've done really well. I'm disappointed, that if you say, the new energy standards actually are coming into it now, are we getting funding off the Scottish Government for projects like that?
In a word, no. All funding to make council properties more energy efficient is funded through the housing revenue account, which is funded solely through rents. So we do have a situation where, for example, all social housing needs to be at EPC level B by 2032, which is challenging, and it's that's not a target that private homes require to achieve. So there is a more exacting standard placed upon council housing than there is on private housing, and it is difficult for us to achieve. We're reviewing the housing revenue account business plan to see how affordable it is, but anybody that has perhaps tried to retrofit their own home, whether it's installation of PV panels or air source heat pumps, it is very expensive, and for certain construction types of properties it's quite technically challenging as well.
Thanks for that.
Any other questions on housing? Can I move on to roads? Any questions on roads? If not, Councillor.
Just one question. I know the extra funding we've put into roads over the past 5 years has done exceptionally well when it comes to the resurfacing. Hopefully in the next 5 years we'll do even better with extra funding again.
And just to add to that comment, it'd be helpful to understand that sort of profile of when we start seeing the impact in the benchmarking standards, because this is 3 years in at the end of 22 of the extra funding, and obviously you've got a further 2 years of the 3 million per year, and then there's another 5 years of 3.5 million a year. So it'd be helpful to understand when should we actually see the fruits of that in terms of a benchmarking perspective. Please, Julie.
Thank you. So the national group called Scots for Transport, they estimate the annual cost of maintaining our carriageways, and that figure is 2.71 million a year. Now that figure was based in 2021 surveys, so that data is obviously out of date, and our challenge is that our costs are much higher now than they were, especially during COVID. So we do have an issue in terms of the impacts that is actually having. So the £3 million per year of additional capital investment since 2019 has lifted the RCI kind of indicator slightly, but not as much as we had anticipated, and that is probably down to increased costs. So as I say, they're based in 2020 and 21, and we are expecting to get our new figures next year, and that will certainly give us a more realistic spend ratio on the roads. But to put it a wee bit more in, it's not, we have spent the money not just on resurfacing the roads. We have, for example, funded the pedestrian crossings for the new nurseries that rolled out across the council area. We have rolled out our replacement street lighting, so that is changing the bulbs to much more energy efficient bulbs, and that reduces our emissions fairly significantly. And we've also replaced obsolete traffic signals. So it's not just been about resurfacing, it's about our capital assets and trying to get the best out of them and reduce emissions at the same time. So the other thing I would like to mention again is the £2.71 million, which is our steady state. So any money that we spend over that for resurfacing the road is actually relatively small when you consider, what the costs are. So next year we will be in a better position to understand exactly what the implications of that is going to be going forward. But as I said at the beginning, there is an increase in the benefits that we can demonstrate through our own figures.
You happy with that response? Gillian, that's very helpful. Thank you. Obviously, I think it's something we need to keep a close eye on in terms of budget setting for future years and managing expectations of what's deliverable with the funds available, being clear on that. But and obviously, it's only 3 years into the campaign, and COVID had issues, etc., in terms of delivery.
Yeah.
So, as we go through the budget process, we'll have a better idea as to what sort of return we should be expecting from this sort of level of investment.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
So if I can go on to the next section. Was roads the last section? No. Waste cleanliness. Any questions on that? No. Councillor.
It's just great to see that we're top in Scotland when it comes to certain parts of recycling. That's a plus for the council.
Again, not just a one-off. It's been there for a while. So you're right to congratulate the team for that. Any other questions? Climate change, trading standards? No. Adult social care services? Councillor Pragnell?
Thank you. As we've mentioned before, there is a time lag, and it's evident from the adult social care services. We've seen the pressures of COVID, and I just want to praise the team under really trying times that they've worked hard, pulled together, and tried to deliver the best for our residents. I have one concern about the percentage of carers who feel supported to continue in their carer role. I'm presuming this is unpaid carers. We've dropped from in 2019 to 20 from 14th to 23. I know Leslie's on the call, if she could answer that, and why the reason for that is, and is it the impact of the pandemic?
Thank you, Councillor Pragnell. I think I can't answer the question scientifically. Anecdotally, I know that the impact of the pandemic had a really significant impact on our carers, in particular unpaid carers. The pattern of care changed, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, where a number of people no longer wanted family members in supported accommodation and so on. So we did have a number of people moving back into the family home, and different arrangements were in place, albeit temporarily. So there was a significant change in the pattern of care and how that impacted on carers. I do know that colleagues who have a lead in this area are undertaking some really significant recovery work, particularly with our partners at the Carers Centre, and I'd be happy to provide a separate briefing with a lot of that detail if it helps. I'm sorry, it's not my area of expertise, so I fear I'm not giving you a full answer right now.
Oh, I appreciate that, Leslie, and I also would like to praise the department for the rate of readmission to hospital within 28 days per 1,000 discharges. That again has improved from 2020 to 2021, and we're now ranked 4th in Scotland. So I think that shows you how our reablement service works and how we are committed to keeping people out of hospital and in the community.
Thanks, Councillor Pragnell. Any other comments on social care services? If we can move on to the next section, which is costs and processes. I think, as alluded to earlier, very difficult to compare like for like across the benchmarking on this because of definitions of costs and issues with improvement services, but I'm not sure if there are any specific questions on this. Councillor...
Thanks, Leader. Just with regards to the comparison, so we have our family group, but I believe that's because we're in the 3rd tier of the local councils, like the size. So there's comparisons there with, I believe it's Orkney, Shetlands. You know, we're included in the small councils. But then when we talk about education, we have the West Partnership, so which is possibly a more reliable comparison. Or if any of the directors have any opinion on that.
Is this specifically on the cost section, or is it a more general question?
Sorry, it's more general. Just
about
in terms
the
of
principles. Okay.
Morag will perhaps keep me right on this if she doesn't mind, but I think that the family groups vary from indicator to indicator. It's not the same family group per indicator, so they do try hard to give us comparable family groupings when they're setting those for these indicators. Don't know, Morag, do you want to say a bit more? Thanks.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, it's just to highlight we've got two family groups. One's linked to population and deprivation for the children's social work and housing indicators, and for the economic development, cultural, corporate and property indicators, there's a separate family grouping. So for the cost ones, the other councils are Angus, Clackmannanshire, Midlothian, South Lanarkshire, Inverclyde, Renfrewshire and West Lothian, and ourselves, and that's our family group for the cost indicators.
Thanks very much. So if move on to, we're nearly there, corporate assets. I'm not expecting any questions on that. Employees, who'd like to come in with that? Councillor Pragnell.
On the first indicator, the percentage of highest paid 5% employees who are women, this is an excellent figure to see. I think it's very evident from our senior management that we have a lot of women in positions of power. And I know that this was highlighted by many women's organisations when we put that post on social media on International Women's Day. So I think we should be praised for this and leading the way on supporting women in work, especially with our menopause policy as well, that we really have in the last couple of years worked really hard to encourage women into more senior roles. So I think that's something we should be commended on.
Thanks. Any other questions on this? I think I'd just like to, just on the sickness days, obviously teachers, excellent, it's best in Scotland, wonderful. And actually in terms of all employees excluding teachers, we've improved our relative ranking nationally and within the peer group. But obviously it's still an increase of around about 2 days, which is fairly significant year on year. I wonder if perhaps, Sharon, you could talk to where we are on that.
Is your question, sorry, can I just clarify the question? Are you just asking about our trends and
the trends and the increasing trend and what we're doing to reduce the absolute increase rather than the relative improvement?
The trend is still decreasing. So for the 22-23 figures are decreasing again. So I think that needs to be acknowledged for local government. I think there's a number of factors that contribute to it, and it's hard to actually say definitively what's causing the increase. We see our higher rates of absence in HSEP, environment and facilities management within education for our local government staff. Now, there's a number of factors in there. We've got high turnover rates in some of the job groupings in there. There's a lot of manual roles, so we've got increased musculoskeletal absence as well when you compare that to other roles. We have got a higher level of temporary contracts. There's been a higher level of change in some areas as well, and obviously pressures of COVID, which people have mentioned as well. And there is financial pressures as well, and I don't think that can go unrecognised because we are seeing a number of staff that have been affected by that. What are we doing? We do continue to look at our policies and procedures and benchmark against other authorities. I would say we're not doing anything different from them. You know, we are keeping up. I think with employee benefits, we have introduced over the last couple of years a lot of financial support. So there's benefits where people can get discounts, and that includes food shopping, etc. So we've been promoting that with employees, especially with the current climate. People can get financial support, you can get better rates for loans, etc. support than you can get through credit unions even, and we work and signpost people to our MARC teams.
The first paper that was brought to Cabinet today, which mentions about COVID reserves, there's been support put into health and wellbeing officers across the council, so HSDP have had one in place for a period of time, and that's proven really popular, and we are seeing benefits from that, and there's a further post been put in to support other areas of the council as well. We do continue to try to signpost because stress continues to be our number one reason, so we are focusing on the health and wellbeing aspect about that. We obviously don't have all the supports within the council, but we've been working with SAMH over the last, really since during COVID. We continue to support employees to take training courses up through SAMH. There's e-learning courses, and we do continue to work with employees to see what supports we could best put in place. It is quite a complex picture. I think I mentioned at the start some of the contracts and high turnover rates. There is moves, obviously budget pressures within services means that there has been some posts that have been kept as temporary. Services are looking at that as much as they can, and there are moves to make more posts permanent. I think that will help. It'll help with recruitment and retention. And I think when you've got high turnover in certain areas, that doesn't help with absence, because it does have a knock-on effect on absence as well. So that's another area in particular that we are looking at.
Thanks very much. Any other comments?
Just one question, Shan. You mentioned that the high turnover, I mean, that's not people employed by the council, that's contractors.
No, it is people. I'm talking about people that are employed by the council. So we've got the turnover rates higher than it's been in previous years, and that's because it's a bit of an employee market just now. So there is a lot of vacancies out there, so people can go to higher paid jobs, and if they're on a temporary contract, they'll maybe leave earlier because they'll see a permanent post elsewhere. It's maybe a more attractive salary as well. So we are competing against quite a competitive market with private sector just now.
They are temporary contracts, are not full-time.
It can be permanent or temporary, so the turnover rates measured against both are temporary and permanent contracts. So it can be people just choosing to leave the organisation.
If you're on a temporary contract, you're not going to go on a sick, you're just not going to turn up for your work. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so that can.
So it's not sickness days, a lot of them?
No, if they're on a temporary contract, it's still a sickness day. It's still an
class as sickness day.
Yes, they're still an employee of the council, even though it's a temporary contract. It's not casual, it's a temporary contract, yeah.
Great. Yeah, would you like to come in?
Yeah, do we actually, I know it's probably hard to actually get the evidence or where the people are going. Do we have the ability, do we have exit interviews or anything to actually try and establish if it's a particular trend?
It's more anecdotal. In fact, I was actually going to use the example which John has used with me. So in neighbourhood services, we traditionally have had pretty stable workforce, and I don't know if this is a commercial where I'm not allowed to mention names, but satellite dish companies are actually now paying higher rates than what we're paying, where that's not in the percent putting bonus sign-on fees. So that's quite attractive to employees, especially in a cost of living crisis where they've maybe got debt and they think, right, I can get a sign-on fee for going to another organisation. They're quite significant fees. So that's just one example. Obviously different examples affect different grades of the organisation, different levels of the organisation. So it does differ depending on what service you're looking at.
Good. If we can move on to the financial ratios, any questions on that? I think you already raised one earlier, Councillor Anderson. So I think with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for your contributions. We've spent quite a bit of time on this, but it is a very important report as it gives us a really good sense of how the council is performing compared to other councils in Scotland, with all the caveats that Jamie had mentioned earlier. Thanks also must be noted for all the additional explanations that officers gave Cabinet separately on items that we didn't cover and explore specifically at this meeting. It's very clear that this is a very strong set of results for this council, and officers should be proud of their achievements. So we're delighted with this set of results. But what's actually more pleasing is we've seen in the discussion today that there are no signs of complacency, and there's certainly a strong culture of continuous improvement which bodes well for the future. So thank you all for all of the work in understanding where we are and your efforts on continuous improvement. So with that, I'd like to go to the recommendations of the paper, which is A, scrutinise the Council's performance against the LGBF indicators, and consider whether any aspect of the Council's performance is in need of improvement or further investigation. Are we agreed with those recommendations? Agreed. So thank you very much for your efforts on that paper. So if I can move on to item number 5, which is the draft Gaelic language plan, which is going to be presented by Jamie. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you. So the paper before Cabinet this morning highlights our statutory duty to produce a Gaelic language plan by October 2023 and to seek approval for the draft plan that's contained in Annex 1 to go out to public consultation as part of that duty. I would just maybe point out that within the papers there was a printing issue on pages 83 and 84, and copies of those tables are available should anyone require that. Just within a piece of context, approximately 1% of our population has some Gaelic language skills, and while being mindful of the need to be inclusive, plans are expected to be reasonable and proportionate based on local circumstances, and that has been at the core of the Council's approach. A working group has been convened across departments to develop and implement a smart action plan to deliver the corporate and high-level aims outlined in the plan. For example, in February 2022, a full assessment of the need for Gaelic medium primary education was carried out, and 11 children were identified for the school years 23-24 and subsequently. And as a result, provision is being located at Thornley Bank Primary School from August 2023, and 2 Gaelic-speaking staff are being recruited within education to support that. The draft plan itself is subject to a minimum 6-week consultation as required to the Act, and the plan will then be revised and brought back to Cabinet before formal submission to Portnagallic at the end of September. So it's recommended that Cabinet note the East Renfrewshire Council's requirement to produce a plan by October 2023 under the Act, approve the draft action plan at Annex 1 as the basis for a statutory consultation on the plan, note the decision contained within the report to apply for external funding to support the purposes of offering Gaelic awareness training for interested staff, and approve the timeline and processes that are set out in paragraph 21.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Any questions? Councillor Pragnell?
It's on the census data. When will we expect to receive the 2022 census data? And because I know in 2011 it was identified there was 874 people who had some skills in Gaelic. So will this, depending on the census data, will this shape the plan going forward?
So we're unlikely to have, I think, local level census data information this year. Normally, in a normal census cycle, we would be expecting the national data to come out this year and then be followed subsequently by more local authority data sets. You'll be aware, though, just in part due to the pandemic and a difference in approach, there were some challenges with this year's census, so those timelines are subject to variation that aren't within our control. So like you, we're very keen to see those figures, but we just don't have an immediate timeline in the moment for when we will get those.
Any other questions on this? Councillor Anderson, or no? Yeah.
Thank you, Leader. Well, first of all, just to thank both Jamie and Julie with the work that's gone on into the plan and putting it all together. And yeah, just thanks for all your efforts. But I think it would be appropriate or possibly to have I know the education part of it is a key part. And I wonder if Mark gives us an update on the status, with the provision at Thornley Bank.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Yeah, happy to do that. The elected members will be aware through Education Committee that we're progressing that. The Gaelic medium primary education will open at Thornley Bank from this summer. Initially, at the moment, the latest numbers are with 4 children in primary 1. We had applied to the Scottish Government for capital funding to support some internal changes to Thornley Bank. I'm delighted to say that we received all that we requested around that. So the other thing that was mentioned in the introduction by Jamie was that we're recruiting the staff. Given that it's full immersion from primary one, you need to make sure that we've got Gaelic speakers. So we've recruited a principal teacher and we're recruiting a 0.5 teacher at the moment to enable that provision to be there throughout the week. And starting that work with the school community to make sure that it's integrated well into the wider work of the campus in that way, and we make sure that we make the best use of this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and thank you both for the report.
Okay, if there's no other questions, then let's go to the recommendations. So it's recommended that Cabinet note the requirements to produce a Gaelic language plan for 23-28, approve the draft plan as the basis of mandatory consultation, note the decision to apply for external funding for the purposes of offering Gaelic awareness training to interested staff, and 4, approve the timeline and process as set out in paragraph 21. Are we all agreed with that? Agreed. Thank you very much. So if we can move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item number 6, request for approval for direct bid to Osiris Educational Woodhall Spa Limited. And who's taking this on? So, I don't have your name there, sorry. Mary, please.
Thank you, Leader. So this report seeks Cabinet approval to award a contract directly to Osiris Educational without the need for open competition, given the education sector-specific professional learning programmes offered by this company, which are also covered by a trademark. A number of our head teachers have already engaged the services of Osiris to deliver aspects of their programmes for staff, and based on very positive evaluations, would wish to have the option of purchasing further services from this company, subject to both budget provision and ongoing priorities identified as part of the normal school improvement planning. Having identified the level of potential spend by our schools over the next 4 years, officers within education sought advice from the Chief Procurement Officer and the Head of Legal Services to determine the most appropriate procurement route to follow. Whilst a contract of this proposed value would normally require competition, given the proprietary nature of the services offered by the organisation, and as there is no reasonable alternative available in the market at the moment offering the same specific training, the professional advice is to enter into direct negotiations with Osiris going forward. Cabinet is therefore asked to approve a direct purchase under Regulation 33 of the Public Contracts Scotland Regulations 2015 from Osiris Educational Woodhall Spa Limited for the provision of professional learning and development at a maximum cost of $200,000 across the duration of the contract. I'm happy to take any questions on that.
Thanks very much, Mary. Any questions? Councillor Anderson.
Thank you very much, Mary. I understand the reason for this, and specifically with regards to Osiris, this may be more a question for Mark in terms of, obviously, with the professional development of the teachers, and specifically why Osiris, and I don't believe it's obviously sector leading potentially, and is that why? I know it has a worldwide reputation, etc. And just to make sure, there isn't a particular alternative, which is why, we're specifically having to go down this route because it is the best. I believe, is that the case?
Yeah, happy to respond to that, Councillor Anderson. Osiris basically overview and link with a leading expert called Professor John Hattie. He's done a huge amount of sort of educational research, and it's them that sort of support that professional learning programme. So the schools have done their own self-evaluation. They've identified the areas within learning and teaching that they need to focus on, particular aspects around assessment and feedback, and having then identified that, this is the company that essentially provides this. So there are other companies that would provide general learning and teaching, professional learning. However, it's the specific nature based on the research that this particular professor has undertaken that is known to have that impact that they want to be able to utilise.
I'm assuming then what's happened is that his intellectual property is now being marketed and applied via Osiris. So I understood. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. If you got any other question, just a clarification really on delegated powers and like. So I'm just, if someone could explain why this item has come to the Cabinet rather than within normal budget approval process, and if that's still appropriate in terms of requirements. I don't know if that's who's able to respond on that.
I think the advice we received from the sort of head of legal and chief procurement office, I think under our current standing orders, I think it would be anything over the value of the 100,000 we had to look at to see what the most appropriate procurement route would be. And having looked at this in the particular issue with this company around that sort of trademark, was that this would be the most appropriate route. But certainly given the value, I think under our current regulations, that needs to come through to Cabinet.
And it's the cumulative value, it's not the 1 year impact.
Yes, so we kind of look at it over 4 years.
So I'm wondering if it's worth a review of those sort of limits, because obviously if there's a budget item within a year is relatively small, but cumulative it's much bigger. I'm wondering if it's worthy of a review of that. Is that one for Margaret to maybe consider?
This is really one for, as I say, the contract standing orders. It would be really for the Council's legal officer to determine. It's not a financial item. Obviously, we would be consulted on that, but it's not part of it's not directly part of the financial regulations. And certainly, we review the financial regulations regularly. There's a review ongoing. It's just about to come back, and I'm sure Jerry also reviews contract standing orders regularly, so we'll take that note away, pass it on to Jerry.
Mark, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just think that the point that you're making, Leader, is a helpful one in that it's the cumulative nature over that time period, but also the extent of the number of establishments, essentially. So in this particular example, it's been 7 secondary schools, and when we've done that sort of deeper look and analysis, we've realised that more than one establishment might want to be using that. So suddenly, as you say, when you start to add that up, and if we were to add in primary schools, suddenly the potential spend becomes larger. So yeah, that would be helpful just to have a look at that.
Okay, thank you very much. So if we can move to the recommendations of the paper, which is asked to approve a direct purchase from Osiris Education at a total cost of £200,000 across the duration of the contract. Are we happy with that recommendation? Agreed? Excellent, thank you. So if we can move on to item number 7, which is external wall insulation contract variation. And I think Phil's going to talk to this paper. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you. The purpose of this report is to advise of a breach of contract standing orders and the request that the required change be approved by Cabinet retrospectively. The Council procured a 1-year contract via a tender exercise for external wall insulation and roof installation. It was tendered on Public Contract Scotland in September 2021 and was awarded in December 2021. Then subsequently a new standard for retrofitting dwellings for improved energy efficiency was published by the Scottish Government in January 2022. That new standard contained additional requirements such as the need to carry out air leakage testing, additional works to external meters to prevent cold spots and thermal loss, and the introduction of mandatory mechanical ventilation. This new standard actually comes with significant improvements to the homes of council tenants and also to owner-occupiers, as it improves the airtightness in their homes, which obviously makes them more energy efficient, which is crucial at a time when energy costs are rising. The Housing Service were aware of the proposed changes that the Scottish Government were going to make, and many of these elements were incorporated into the contract, which was awarded a few months before. The contract was awarded to an organisation called Procast Building Contractors in December 2021, with a contract value of just under £1.8 million. There was an expectation that the contract would run for 36 weeks and be completed by August 2022. In terms of the tender process, the contract out of the 3 tenders returned was the most economically advantageous tender. However, as I'd noted at paragraph 11, although the contract value was just under £1.8 million, as at 23rd of March 2023, the total spent was actually just over £2 million. The final account is still to be settled, but it is estimated will be around £2.2 million, which is 23% above contract value. Now, budgetary provision for this increased cost was reported to Cabinet on the 1st of December 2022, so there aren't any financial implications associated with this report today. But Contract Standing Orders 14 states that a contract can be extended by a sum of no more than 15%, and if an extension of either above 15% or a increase of more than £100,000 must be reported to Cabinet for approval prior to the increase being instructed. In this instance, contract standing orders were not required with, as the required approval to vary the contract was not sought and obtained in advance from the Cabinet. The errors occurred with the management of the contract in relation to the financial monitoring of the spend against the contract sum. What I mean by that is the average cost per property was greater than anticipated, which resulted in an increase in spending overall. As such, an overcommitment occurred before the probable outturn was established, and this should have been noticed sooner, and I'll come on to the reasons for that in a moment. The problem was exacerbated because the new standard is quite complex. For example, the space between the eaves that was required for insulation under the old standard was 150 mil, under the new standard it's 250 mil. Sometimes that means that the eaves need to be extended in order to accommodate the additional thickness of the insulation, which led to an increase in cost. Moreover, it's increasingly complicated because the standard needs to be applied to 12 different types of property. It wasn't just one type of property we're applying this to, there's 12 different types. I would note that the Council's procurement team carried out a best value comparison with other councils to establish that the contractor's costs for similar projects were comparable, and that exercise found that those costs were found to be comparable. So although the council spent more against the contract, we still achieved best value in relation to that. So as such, it isn't the case that we've overpaid. The error relates to not informing Cabinet sooner. As a consequence of the error, a review of procedures and working practices has been undertaken. In particular, more regular monitoring of contract spend against budget will be undertaken. Furthermore, additional staffing resources have been sought to increase capacity for additional contract scrutiny and monitoring. And I spoke earlier in terms of context. At the time the error occurred, the team were working on around 32 different projects. Ordinarily, they would be working on around 24 projects. But in 2022, because there was a backlog of work that occurred during 2020 and 2021 as a result of COVID, the team were working on, say, on 32 projects instead of 24, but also at the same time, the team have been under capacity in terms of staffing and working at 60% normal staffing levels for over a year. As Sharon explained earlier, it's an employee market at the moment. We've had 2 unsuccessful recruitment attempts to increase the size of the staff team. We're struggling to get quantity surveyors at the moment, and we're just about to go out for a third time to try and increase the staffing resource, and as such I'm happy to recommend this report to Cabinet.
Thank you very much, Phil. Councillor Devlin.
Just a few questions, Phil. I mean, the council procured a 1-year contract via a tender exercise for internal insulation and roof insulation, blah, blah, blah. The contract was tendered in Public Contract Scotland, September 21, and awarded in December 2021. In previous years, a tender has been issued with the request for contractors to provide a cost per property, right? However, in 2021, 2022, the project was tendered using a bill of quantities, right? Why was this method used instead of the old method, which is a proven method?
In part because there were elements of the standard that were unknown because of that time gap or the time difference between the contract being awarded and then the Scottish Government finalising the details of the new standard. We had early indication of what the new standard would contain, but we didn't have a definitive indication of what the standard would contain.
Could the old standard be used in that contract? Could it have been used?
It wouldn't have been advisable because we would have done work to properties to a certain standard, which then at a later date would have needed to have gone back and done the additional work to meet the new standard, and because of things such as cost of scaffold, cost of site, etc., in the long run it would have been more expensive.
Right. And another question, this bill, the bill of quantities, a document incorporates details of materials, labour and other work requirements with estimated quantities for each. These materials, labour and work requirements are itemised along with estimated quantities. The contractor then prices the bill for tendering purposes. I mean, he's gave us a price to do this work, and obviously it's ran over £401,000. What liability, have we got any liabilities over him for the contract exceeding 400,000? He gave us a price.
Because it's a bill of quantities, if the quantities change, then the price will change. So the price per quantity was valid. It was just because additional work was required, then additional quantity. So by quantity, I don't necessarily mean number of properties.
Yeah.
But for example, if you're looking at insulation requirements, if the quantities of insulation per property increases, then the cost will increase. So there isn't a concern that the contractor has done anything inappropriate because the quantities required increased, therefore the cost increased.
Sorry, did the contractor ever intimate at any time, that there was going to be an overspend? I mean, surely, I don't know many properties I've done, I think it was at 30, 40, but surely when you were halfway through that contract, you would have had an idea of the cost of the properties that the contractor had finished.
I think that's the reference I'm making to more frequent monitoring of contract spend against budget would have highlighted that issue earlier. I don't think it wouldn't have changed the amount that we required to pay for the contract. What would have changed is that this report should have been brought to Cabinet sooner to seek approval of the Cabinet to vary the contract in advance rather than retrospectively. So the costs aren't the issue, it's the timing of this report. This report should have been brought sooner, so it didn't need to be approved retrospectively.
Right, just one more question, sorry, two more questions. I mean, when this contract started, did we have the resources, basically the manpower to monitor this contract?
I think in hindsight now, as I've explained, 24 projects is the normal workload that our technical services team would have. They were looking at a workload of about 32, and in addition, they were dealing with a reduced staffing content. I have spoken to the team. There will be occasions, I think, in the future where we need to say certain work needs to be done, but it will need to be deferred because it isn't just a case of can we afford to pay for the work, but have we got the staffing levels to complete the work to the necessary standard? And that is a conversation I'm having with the team at the moment.
I think it's very important when any contract starts, we need to have the resources to see it through. Yeah. Just one last question. I mean, the £400,000, is that a hit for the housing revenue account?
No, some of the money comes from the Scottish Government because some of the work is undertaken for owner-occupiers under the HEAP-SAB scheme, so that the full liability doesn't pass onto the housing revenue account. In fact, the majority probably doesn't.
But what is the liability to the housing revenue account?
I will
financial?
Get that level of detail. I will split it down between housing revenue account and Scottish Government grant.
That's great.
Margaret, do you want to come in? Or?
Yes, just to say, Phil mentioned in his report that Cabinet had already had some sort of notification on this on the 1st of December through the regular capital monitoring report, and at that point we did say that we were transferring £500,000 from the energy efficiency capital budget within housing towards this. and that was valid partly to meet the cost and partly because the whole premise of this work was to increase energy efficiency in the premises. In the total revenue account, it's remained within the budget.
Thanks for the clarification of that. There's no other questions, if I may. Phil, I really appreciate the transparency in this report and being open about what went on and what didn't work well. That's very welcome. I know internal audit, and I know there's been a lot of time spent on reviewing the processes and how you can make sure that that doesn't happen again. And I have been given reassurances from management that that is now the case. It might be helpful if internal audit, I know they're here but not on a microphone, is able to confirm that the processes are now where they should be. And also, if someone can confirm, I think this might be going to the Audit and Scrutiny Committee as well. So that would be helpful to confirm that. Just a final question, how many properties were actually insulated as part of this programme as well?
It's an ongoing programme which will be undertaken extra year. When I obtain the information about the split between Scottish Government subsidy and council properties, I'll get that information as well.
Okay, is anyone able to talk about the reassurance on the processes and audit scrutiny?
I wasn't aware, but I'm happy to take a further paper to the Audit and Scrutiny Committee.
I was just looking for clarification. I wasn't recommending it.
I could just add that mention of this report is included in the internal audit progress report, which is going to Audit and Scrutiny this very afternoon.
That's what I sort of suspected, so thanks for that clarification. And just clarification about where we are on the processes. We are now comfortable that this will not happen again. Can we get some reassurances on that?
The procedures have been revised. We're in the process of being finalised, so one can never give an absolute assurance that, because obviously there's human error, etc., but the chances of it happening again are substantially reduced.
Thanks for that clarification. So with that, can I go to the recommendations of the report, which is for the Cabinet to note a breach of the contract standing orders and approve that the required variation be approved by Cabinet retrospectively. Are we agreed on that? Agreed. Thank you very much. Now, moving on to item 8 on the agenda, which is Get to Zero Action Plan, which again is Phil to talk to us about this. Thank you.
Thank you. The purpose of this report is to present to Cabinet the East Renfrewshire Council's draft Get to Zero Action Plan and the proposals for public consultation. Members will be aware that the Council declared a climate emergency in October 2021 and also agreed a Get to Zero ambition statement in November 2021. Subsequently, a draft Get to Zero action plan was prepared with input from staff across all departments, and that input took place via a series of workshops between May and June 2022. Now, under the Environmental Assessment Scotland Act 2005, public bodies are required to assess and consult and monitor the likely impact of their plans on the environment. So as such, we required to undertake a strategic environmental assessment of the draft Get to Zero action plan. That has been completed and is contained within an appendix to this document. It is quite a lengthy and somewhat dry document, I think it's not unreasonable to say. But the Council is now in a position to consult on the draft Get to Zero action plan. It addresses the need to reduce the Council's own operational emissions and also recognises our role in reducing the emissions of the local community, i.e. residents and businesses. Whilst public consultation is required prior to the adoption of the action plan, and that public consultation may result in amendments, it was considered prudent to bring the draft to Cabinet to highlight the anticipated key implications of the plan. In November 2022, the Cabinet agreed to set a target for the Council of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2045, which is in line with the Scottish Government's targets. There are no formal interim targets, but the Scottish Government has set set a national interim target of 75% reduction by 2030 and 90% reduction by 2040, and I can comment on those interim targets if you wish. Paragraphs 13 and 14 of the paper detail the proposed approach of key areas in the Get to Zero action plan. So, for example, in relation to the council's estates, that is the properties that it owns, the schools, the libraries, the community centres, etc., there is a target of such properties being net zero by 2038. Important to note that that is not a legal requirement, that's just a policy desire of the Scottish Government. Similarly, a desire to reduce car kilometres travelled by 20% by 2030 against the 2018 baseline. And again, that is not a legal requirement. And paragraph 13 and 14 continues to outline some of the key areas. Supply chain emissions, i.e. what we buy as a council, constitutes 50% of our carbon emissions. However, they are not currently included in our target setting, and that's consistent with all local authorities. And the reason for that is the data behind carbon emissions from what we buy is still relatively unreliable, and therefore we can't form a plan based upon that. So, for example, if we were to consider the food that we buy for our schools, we don't necessarily know the carbon footprint of that food because we're buying it from suppliers, and the information that the suppliers will have on their carbon footprint may not be accurate, could potentially be misleading, so therefore it wouldn't be prudent to contain that in our Get to Zero action plan. Paragraph 16 notes that whilst the proposed plan is an ambition statement, it is subject to financial resources being made available to the council. In terms of timescales, the anticipation is the plan will be reviewed every year, both reviewing progress and reviewing available funding opportunities, either from the Scottish Government or from third parties. The next 12 to 18 months is likely to be a preparatory period where significant work, for example, changes to our buildings, perhaps will not begin until financial year 25-26. Again, a note in terms of cost, at a time of unprecedented budget constraints, the costs of the Get to Zero action plan are potentially quite considerable. To date, the Scottish Government have given no indication of what support, if any, they will provide to local authorities to help us deliver this, which is why it's an ambition statement as much as a detailed action plan. In terms of the consultation exercise, we have a number of statutory consultees, such as the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, Nature Scotland and Historic Environment Scotland. We're going to have a 6-week consultation period. 7 questions are being asked, and they're contained for members at paragraph 22. Detailed costs for individual projects will be brought forward on a project-by-project basis, and as such, I'm happy to recommend the report to Cabinet and to take any questions.
Thank you, Phil. Any questions on this report? Phil, I welcome this report. Great to see it. As you said, it's an ambition statement. This is a very complex area, and it's rapidly changing. So it will be out of date in a week's time, just given the whole technology and environment is changing. So I think it's right that it's an ambition statement, and it will change regularly. And I welcome the chance to review it again in full in October, but on an annual basis, because it will be rapidly changing. The financing environment is very opaque, if anything is available and when it will be available. But it has given us a route of travel, which is very helpful, I think very welcome for everyone. I note our consultation is a little bit lighter compared to the transport strategy. I would guess that over time that we will do further consultation, perhaps a little bit more in depth, as and when some of these plans become a little bit more thought through and worked out. Is that sort of a fair assessment?
Yes, I think that because, so for example, transport is perhaps a subset of the overall Get to Zero action plan. So when we look at certain things like, for example, property, we can do a more detailed consultation. But it's such a wide and vast topic. We want the kind of high-level indicators from the consultees as opposed to the level of detail, because otherwise the detailed responses we would get in would probably be too vast for us to bring together and analyse in any coherent sense.
Thanks for that. So if there's no other comments from Cabinet, can I ask Cabinet to recommend A, approve the draft Get to Zero action plan and related environmental report for public consultation for a period of 6 weeks, and B, note that a final Get to Zero action plan will be presented to Cabinet in November 23 for formal approval. Are we all agreed with that? Phil, thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. And now we move on to the last item on the agenda, which is the local transport strategy main issues consultation. And this will be presented by Gillian McCartney. Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you. The purpose of this report is to inform Cabinet on our local transport strategy, and I'll just call it the LTS moving forward. And we're seeking approval to commence consultation with the community. So it's calling it a main issues consultation, so it's the first one that we're going to do. Cabinet has to note that the proposed LTS follows the publication of the National Transport Strategy and the Regional Transport Strategy in 2020 and 2023. And both these strategies outline visions for delivering a sustainable, inclusive, safe and accessible transport system for a healthier and fairer transport system. We're all aware that a good quality transport system is fundamental to society and well-being and prosperity. The LTS will consider how local transport and access align with both national and regional strategies, in addition to our own local policy. The main issues consultation is the first stage of this LTS development and will gather evidence, feedback on priorities and future priorities, and will shape the LTS moving forward. A proposed transport survey is attached at Appendix 1, and that's what we're calling the main issues consultation, and this will seek issues, opportunities and general engagement from the public. The survey itself will cover active travel, which is walking, cycling and wheeling. It will cover public transport, trains and buses, car travel, how people are changing their travel habits, and the future transport priorities of our residents. We have a draft consultation and engagement plan that is being worked up at the moment, and we will be using this for the next stage of our public consultation. We are actively seeking to find those groups and people that are furthest away from engaging with the council, and that will come out in the final engagement plan for this document.
Thanks, Gillian. Any comments from Cabinet? Gillian, I really welcome this report, and I think the consultation is critical. It's very emotive for everyone is impacted by transport. Issues on active travel, issues on buses, trains, cars, all of that's very important. So I'm very pleased to hear that you're going to try to, in the consultation, reach those people that are harder to normally contact, and I'm sure Graham and Comms will help on that. I think it's important that members of this council, members of Cabinet, get as full of a view as to what our residents are thinking about on these important issues. So I really welcome this report and welcome the consultation, and look forward to seeing what the results will be. I'm sure we may be surprised by some of the responses. Councillor Anderson.
You talked about how to get it out there. I noticed right at the end it says return your completed form in the envelope provided. So are we looking at potentially mail, delivering to residents, or can people do it online as well as part of the strategy?
We'll do a combination. We will identify, for example, groups that may require, to be written to, and we will also have the, online consultation using the common platform, the council's consultation space online.
I think it's a good idea to encourage the prize draw. Anything help, to get the feedback, it's, the consultations, very important.
Yeah.
As I already mentioned. Yeah, great, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so with that, and I know there's been an awful lot of work on this. We first talked about the strategy, I think, at the June meeting last year. So, there's been a lot of work behind this, so I really appreciate that. And actually, similar, and I didn't mention earlier, the Get to Zero plan, there's been huge amounts of work on that over a long period of time. So thanks for all the efforts on that plan as well. So if I can go to the recommendations of the paper, and Cabinet is asked to note the background to the local transport strategy main issues consultation, and review and approve the transport survey, Appendix 1, which will be utilised to support community engagement. We all agreed on that. So thank you very much. And with that, we draw the meeting to a close. Thank you very much.